Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Danger on Delmarva. My name is Rhonda Franny Jefferson, and I'll be your host as we take this journey through Delmarva and discuss any tragedies, whether they be crime or any man made or natural disaster that has occurred on Delmarva, which includes all of Delaware, Maryland to the east of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and Virginia to the north of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. Now, this is a continuation of an episode that I started about an incident on Dover Air Force Base that would have been published just a few days ago. It was a very long video, very long episode, so I did split it into two, but I'm trying to get these out together as quickly as possible. But if you have not listened to the first episode, you will definitely want to go back and listen to that, as any of the upcoming information would not really be understood unless it had that other part. I was also joined by a fellow podcaster, Brad from Killin, Missin, Hidden, and I'll have the link to his podcast as well in the description, and as usual, any sources as well as my contact information will be in the description as well. I normally give a very long disclaimer, but as this is the second part of a case, all of the same disclaimers still apply. To summarize, that I've gleaned all of this information from publicly available sources, that as they have been gleaned from these sources, I cannot guarantee 100% the complete validity or accurateness of all statements, but I always do double check information. And as a warning, this does include the death of a child. So if this is something that you may not want to hear, then I'll have another episode out as soon as I can. But this episode can be very difficult. And without any further ado, let's get into the rest of this story. To our listeners, I had actually shown Brad some of this information previously, but actually over the last couple of days, there was a case that I was looking at, and I've come to see, because it's not actually something Brad and I discussed before, so I hope you don't mind, Brad. But sometimes it seems like if a child dies by child abuse, it seems sometimes the sentences aren't as severe. It's called, like this one is a criminally negligent homicide, or this one, the murder by abuse or neglect by recklessly causing the death of a child, that was a minimum of 10 years. So it's almost like if it was an older child or an adult, that same thing might have held, like second degree murder or manslaughter, that might have held a longer prison term. I know it all varies by state, but I've seen some child abuse cases that ended up in death that they seem to have gotten very light in sentences unless they went to, say, extreme measures afterwards to cover up the fact. So do you have any ideas about that? Have you seen that too, with the different charges? It's not just murder, first or second degree.
Yeah, I mean, every case is different. Every case is unique, and so it's hard to make blanket statements. But to the standpoint that somebody's charged with murder and the jury finds them guilty of criminally negligent homicide, what the jury is essentially saying is, we believe that they are responsible for the death of the child, but it was not an intentional act that caused the death. That they did something kind of reckless, kind of foolish, that caused the child to suffer these injuries. And that's a very important distinction under our criminal laws, because obviously we've traditionally taken the approach, throughout American history, going back into English law history, someone intentionally murdering someone is a significant offense, whereas someone, if in Alabama at least, if you are in a car accident and you kill someone, you're automatically charged with criminally negligent homicide. And it's not until they go through the investigation and all that they determine, if it was the other person's fault, then the charges will get kicked out and all that. But if they can't determine clearly that it was not your fault, you actually have to go to trial
Oh,
on that
wow.
charge. Because you are, they take the approach of you did something to cause this accident. You did not mean to kill this person, but it resulted in their death. And obviously, that's hugely different than hiring a hitman
Mm-hmm.
or waiting in
Plotting.
somebody's closet and jumping them.
Yeah.
So I would think that to the extent that you're getting verdicts based on it being a negligent homicide, that's why you're seeing the lighter sentences, because there's no finding by the jury, who is the ultimate decider of what
Mm-hmm.
happened in the case. What they say the facts are, that's legally what the facts are. Um, they're
Mm-hmm.
saying this was not an intentional act, and the judge has to sentence accordingly.
Okay. Yeah, so it's kind of maybe an adult version, or the adult version would be kind of like getting into a fight and hitting someone, too hard or recklessly, and they end up falling and hitting their head, or, it was
Yeah,
not, it was not intended, but it was the consequence.
right, right.
Okay.
You
So,
you kind of put the ball in motion that ended
mhm.
up killing them.
So the next step will be for me to tell everybody what the sentence was for Justin Corbett. But I want to review things that, you know, that were also reviewed during sentencing. And I did try to keep an open mind when I did begin this research. I wasn't there. Nobody was except Justin and the two children.
Hmm.
Nobody else who testified was there. And so we have to take Justin Corbett's word. And he had actually received two good conduct medals during his service. And, he had, let's see. So I'm a parent too. And, looking at this, another thought would be that Corbett may have known CPR. That was another thing. I think Nikki Dudley mentioned. I know that too, things can change very quickly. Little ones can get away from you, they can fall. Um, and, I want the answer to things. I know I'm kind of giving a lot of thoughts at one time, but, all of these things were going through my mind when, okay, I'm trying to figure out, if I were the judge, what would I give to him as a sentence? And, I think as adults or as parents, not even parents, who has a loved one, what would we want done? We want someone, to pay the appropriate um, sentence. So, I tried to go into any research impartially, thinking of all these different things. And, even though there were a lot of things on the news, like actual television news, there weren't as many articles as I would have expected. And
Hmm.
yeah, as a juror, I don't know how I would have felt about this case. Um, and I'm sorry, I'm going in a few different directions right now. But my biggest hurdle was really the fact that the Corbetts only watched EJ occasionally. And, he spent most of his time with his godmother. There was no definitive proof that the injuries were done exactly while he was there at the Corbetts. So
Hmm.
that's why some of the testimony, about, oh, he was happy and healthy the day before, there was still that inkling, okay, but that was the day before. And I did read
Hmm.
in an article with an interview um, with Nicole that did shed some light on a few things. And that caused me to start leaning more one way than the other. Nicole Dudley said that Corbett's changed his story. At different times, he said he didn't see what happened. Then other times that his son had pushed him. And frankly, if my son, even though he was had pushed someone that led to a death, I probably would have wanted to try to protect him. Not even, they're not
Sure.
going to prosecute a 2-year-old, but at the same time,
Right.
yeah, he would live with that for the rest of his life. Like there would always be kind of this knowledge, if he ever heard about that. So you want to try to protect them. Then there was EJ had fallen from the landing all the way down the stairs to he fell backwards. So there really wasn't this consistent story. So that, though, was not entirely indicative of guilt. Like I said, if his son had pushed EJ, that's his instinct to protect. And saying that he fell from the landing and he fell backwards, that doesn't really cancel each other out. He could have fallen backwards from the landing. So,
Mm-hmm.
but what I just mentioned a few moments ago about the CPR, Corbett said that he did not perform CPR because he didn't know how to do it. But
Mm-hmm.
there were notations in some of these statements about this particular topic. But even without notations about anyone who was on the base or an airman, they had to know how to do CPR. So before I even got to that, I was questioning it. My mother worked in a hospital cafeteria for years. They all had to be certified in CPR, and they would have to take like refresher courses, and they work in the cafeteria. So it's
Right.
a requirement. And so even before Nicole Dudley mentioned that he would have had to know CPR, my mind was already going to that idea. So, and just going back to the example of my mother, everybody, whether it was maintenance, custodial, people who worked at the registers, anybody who worked in that hospital had to have that training. So, as I was going to say, that it's required that members of the U.S. military are trained in CPR and they have to go through recertification every 2 years. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not as though it's been 5 years had training, it's every 2 years. Now,
Right.
if he had said he had froze, yeah, I think I could have understand him freezing. I mean, my grandnephew fell in a pool one time, and there were people there who knew CPR, but it's like, okay, this is someone I love, and they froze. Everything
Oh
was
yeah.
fine, yeah, but it that that's his situation. But it really did make me wonder, why didn't he at least try to do something?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess you could probably feel shock, going into shock, but the changing story is really got to me. So another thing it made me think of is, do you know that if there's any requirement that if someone knows how to do a life-saving technique like CPR and they don't attempt it, can they be charged with anything, or does that vary by state, do you think?
I'm so glad you asked that question because I get to tell the story of mine from law school. I had a torts professor who had the greatest example explaining this concept. Under all of our law comes from English law originally, and we've a lot of the principles we have come from English law. And unless the legislature has passed a statute otherwise, we rely on this common law, as it's called. And so the common law on this issue has always held that you have no duty to aid. And my professor, way back when in law school, her example was, if you're walking out of the grocery store or you're walking out of work and you're in the parking lot and you see this like 2-month old baby laying face down in a puddle, and literally to save its life, all you had to do was just kick it on its back with your toe. You have no obligation under the law to kick the baby. So, and on top of that, a lot of states have passed laws that make it like I know in Alabama, obviously, if you undertake a duty to try to provide care, you can't be charged with anything if it goes wrong.
A good Samaritan law, I
But
think.
you're still not obligated to perform the care. And so I've always loved the kick the baby story because you can't put together a more vile situation where you'd want to charge somebody. But
Yeah.
there's just no duty to do that. We don't require people to, they could be, and I think what it comes down to is the public policy idea of, what if you're driving down the road and you see an accident? Are you obligated to stop? Is the person behind you obligated to stop? Is the person in front of you obligated to stop? And it would just create a mess, especially during rush hour when you have hundreds of cars going by the scene of an accident. I think it's just been generally decided that you're under no obligation to help. There's always exceptions, like if you create the injury,
Okay.
you have a duty to at least, call someone to come help, but you wouldn't have to perform CPR even if you know it.
So sometimes it comes down more to a moral or ethical feeling or obligation as compared to the actual legal obligation.
Right.
And I'm glad you mentioned, in most states, I think it's called something like a Good Samaritan law, that if you
Correct.
try to help someone and they're injured, that
Yeah.
you can't, yeah, that you're not going to be held liable for, say, breaking a rib while you're doing CPR or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, because actually, not too well, it was a little while ago. I fell in a store, and it was because a carpet had like flipped up somehow. It was wet outside, and they
Mm-hmm.
had this throw carpet down, I guess, to wipe your feet. And not one person came over except for a woman who looked to be in her 80s to help me. And I mean, not even the cashiers. Like, nobody came over to help. And afterwards, I was like, oh, I kind of wonder if it's because they thought if I, like, say, if I couldn't get up and I fell again,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
somebody would hold them liable. And it's
Right.
kind of sad, too, that it's gotten to that point you have to have laws to say, okay, if you try to help someone, you won't get in trouble for trying to help them.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah. So, looking at the Corbetts here, that going back to that one blog by one of Nikki Dudley's friends, she says that Aubrey Corbett stated that she and her husband had not spoken during the incident. So while all this was going on, supposedly Aubrey did not know what was going on. But, you know, I still amazes me. I know this was over 10 years ago, but people don't realize police do check call records. They do look at that stuff.
Yeah.
And, again, I do just want to say this is from a blog by an article written by a friend of Nikki Dudley's, but they did speak during that time frame. It also said that Corbett posted to Facebook earlier that day. The quote was, "I can't wait for the work week as the weekends hold nothing but stress for me."
Mm.
And they tried to use
That
that
does that
as,
doesn't look good.
yeah, and yeah, at first glance, it's like, okay, so was he dreading EJ coming over? Like, okay, I have to watch two kids instead of just my son. What was he thinking? But yeah, I can say sometimes I've been in those situations too, where it's been like, okay, Saturday morning, do the shopping, Saturday afternoon, get the laundry done, Saturday night, so that your whole weekend is really
Yep.
filled up. But yeah, my initial
Yep.
thought was, oh, really? So you're seeing this little boy as stressful, this little innocent child.
Yeah.
But um, okay, I'm trying not to laugh on this one. The post was not allowed because the judge was not familiar with social media.
Okay.
Now, granted, this was a little while ago, but still,
Sure.
the trial itself took place in 2016. So while the events happened earlier, the trial was in 2016. So, yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure by then probably social media had been used in some court cases by that point. So it's
Oh, no
not like,
doubt.
yeah, it wasn't, I'm thinking it's not something like the very first time that DNA was ever used in a trial, where you
Hmm.
had to have an understanding of the science. This was somebody typed something on a computer that millions of people possibly could have seen, depending
Right.
on whatever his security or privacy settings were. So, I did actually try to find anything about that, search terms like using the judge's name in Facebook, or just something to try to find out something specifically about that article, but I came up with nothing. So then again, it was a very specific search.
Right,
Um,
right.
so some of these things took me from being off the fence from leaning towards guilty. Like he had to be guilty of something. Whether it was intentional or not, there was some guilt. And if I had been on the jury and had to make a decision at some point in time, I think, I know people might not agree with this, but I might have had to acquit on most charges because of that beyond a reasonable doubt. Because
Mm-hmm.
the godmother, anytime that day, puts that just little bit of doubt in my mind. My emotions, though, seeing the pictures that I saw, say convict. But if I looked at my job as a
Right,
juror, and I've actually been a juror, which the case was declared a mistrial, you know, it, stepping back and not putting my emotions in there, I think I would have had to acquit unless they had some, other charges in there that he could have been charged for. Because
mm-hmm.
yeah, if EJ had been dropped off at Corbett's house the way that he looked in those pictures, and I know swelling does take a while to occur. So if it had
Sure.
just happened, there might not be any swelling, but he should have called 911 earlier based on how severe the injuries were. You know, I, and again, emotionally, I want to say convict, but there really was not a lot of surefire evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of this, I wanted to say give him the max after I saw the pictures. Um, but do you think emotions play a big role in convictions, even if there was no, like, say, definitive proof? It was all circumstantial.
Yeah, it definitely. In fact, that's probably the most important factor in my experience in dealing with jurors. Is I mean, I've had jurors literally tell me after a trial, "Well, we didn't think he was guilty, but we couldn't take the chance."
Oh,
Which is kind of like a kick to the belly.
oh,
Um,
that's, mm,
and it's because it's that particular case was sexual abuse on a child.
mm-hmm,
And so, on one hand, I understand that reaction. On the other hand, um, that's not your job as a
yeah,
juror. So yeah, no, emotions are, in my experience, are probably as important as the actual facts, and you have to manage that a lot when you're in a trial.
yeah. I know in the case that I was actually an alternate juror, but I was there during the parts of the case that were presented.
Sure.
The last person picked, and I'm like sitting there, got my purse in my hand, like, okay, we're going, and they call my name. But after the mistrial was declared, I had lunch with a couple of the other jurors, and we all said we would have found him guilty,
Mm-hmm.
even though they had barely presented any evidence because there was that
Mm-hmm.
emotion. And I was very young then. I was like 19 or 20, so I was really, really
Sure.
young. Um, but now I probably would look back and say, okay, I see why a mistrial was, um, was called. Information was brought up that was not the prosecutor knew they did not have evidence for, and she still brought it up.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it was kind of prejudicial.
Yeah.
So I understand that and work on it 20 some years later. Okay, I realize that's not how our justice system should work.
Right.
But looking at this case, it's like this child died. He's not going to ever get to know any of the joys of learning how to ride a bike without training wheels, without all those little things that everybody takes for granted.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to thinking about Justin Corbett, if he had injuries beforehand, I do think he should have called 911 because those injuries were severe enough. They would have been
Right.
apparent. But do I
Right.
think Justin Corbin woke when he woke up that morning? Did he say, "I'm going to get so mad I'm going to beat a child"? No, I don't think anybody would ever think that. And if
Right.
everybody, if we looked at everybody's social media and had some of those little things we you say just to vent, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, anything, then we would all be in a lot of trouble,
Yeah.
probably.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. So
And
so
that's
if
why
you
a lot
just
of
snap,
social media isn't used
mm,
in cases because you're not it would fall under the hearsay rule in that it's an out of court statement being offered to prove a fact.
okay,
There's also concerns about how authentic the statement is. Was it if there was some technical error that caused words to be deleted or something like that from the posting, and so you know introducing that is on the burden's on the attorney who wants it in the case.
okay,
And if they can't meet the evidentiary standard, then the judge has no choice but to say you can't present it.
gotcha.
Now, for the judge to couch it in terms of I don't understand this,
Yeah.
that's probably not the smartest way to handle it. But
Um,
that there could be a reason beyond the judge's ignorance.
yeah, I think we can. Now that you brought that up, we can probably look at autocorrect. For
Hmm.
some things that we may have sent that we did not intend to
Oh
send.
yeah.
Um, or even did he send it? If you don't have a lock on your phone, like a PIN
Yep.
code or a fingerprint, theoretically anybody could have sent it.
Yeah.
Um, but waking up and just kind of maybe snapping or getting upset, it doesn't excuse what he did. And when you're that much bigger than that small child, all it takes is one hit or push or anything, and
Hmm.
it's really magnified on a child because they're so much smaller than an adult. Um,
Yeah.
Now, given the extent of his injuries, I think it would have had to have been more than one hit. And once
Yeah.
you take
I
that
agree.
second hit, yeah, that second hit then to me shows somewhat of an intent. Maybe not to kill,
Yeah.
but to hurt. And so, as you can probably tell by all of my thoughts, I'm going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I'm trying to temper my emotions with facts. And, I do not envy these jurors at all for what they had to kind of wade through and try to put their emotions aside. Um, so, criminally negligent homicide can carry up to 8 years of prison. Now, what did Justin Corbin get? 18 months of probation. Probation.
Mm.
So, regardless of, if I can sit back and say, you know what, I'm not entirely convinced, that it was all his fault or, exactly what he did, I'm still pretty sure he had to have done something. He did. So to get 18 months of probation, ah, that for his mother, that had to be like to say it was a slap in the face is an understatement, but maybe punch to the gut, like you said earlier.
Especially when the judge is, yeah, especially when the judge is presented with now the fact that the
Hmm.
jury has said he's responsible for the death of the child,
Exactly.
and that's tough. That's a very it's a very light sentence.
Yeah, and it's okay. It made a good point. Then the judge is presented with the fact that the jury has found him guilty of something, and that something carries up to 8 years. It's at that point, on a um, I guess you would say slander or libel, depending on if you're writing or verbally saying something. You can take the word alleged out because they have now been
Hmm.
convicted, and instead of saying the
Right.
alleged killer, alleged abuser, it's they are convicted of that. So you can take that word
Right.
out. It is now fact, but he got 18 months of probation. And yeah, I almost wonder if the jury, once they heard that, if they had to sit back and say, wow, 18 months. Um, I don't know what was going through everyone's mind. Maybe it was that small piece of doubt of whether or not he showed up
Mm-hmm.
there with some injuries. Um, it's a child isn't when a child is in your care, it's your responsibility. So whether or not you intended to hurt him or not, something happened, and then it seems like he didn't do all he could to try to save that child. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so kind of reflecting back on everything, I don't think the Facebook post would have really affected my decision. Like I said, there's lots of things that I feel stressed about on the weekends. Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah. So that didn't mean that much to me as far as his guilt, but to see probation, and just the child had such severe injuries. And there was enough testimony
Yeah.
to indicate that, yeah, that these injuries were not an accident. So really, he just had some time served, and that was it. Now, something I did find interesting is part of his probation was he could not be around children, including his own, which
Mm-hmm.
frankly is understandable. If you're convicted of anything involving abuse with a child, yeah, why let them near another child, even if it's their own? But,
Right.
what about things too, like daily life, going to a park or a family event, like say your grandmother's birthday party, and your nieces and nephews will be there, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have to get like an approval, do you know, or can it vary by state?
My experience with that is traditionally it's enforced based on your residency. So
Okay.
if you're living with a child, that would be a violation of your probation.
Okay.
Um, but you can also do it in other ways. For example, I had a client one time who was a registered sex offender,
Mm.
and one of his favorite activities was to go to the park and sit and watch the kids, and he got
Oh.
arrested for that. Well,
Mm.
okay, he's intentionally putting
Yeah.
himself in the position to be around children. So, your example of going to a birthday party where you know there's going to be children present, that would probably be considered a violation of the probation. In my experience, when a judge lays down a condition of probation, unless he specifically or she specifically states otherwise, it's not something that's waivable. And
Okay.
so, if the judge's order says you cannot be around children, there's not going to be an exception to that. I mean, if you can go to the grocery store and do your shopping and walk by children,
Okay.
but you just can't put yourself in a position where you will be around children
Okay.
and not violate that order.
Okay. Yeah, it's just that was a very interesting condition, but as the mother of those children, I mean, with Aubrey, his wife, I mean, I would never want to leave my child alone with him again, even though it is
Oh,
their
certainly.
father. Um, so the final decision ultimately was up to the judge as far as sentencing. Do you think maybe
Mm-hmm.
any of his military awards might have played a role in the sentencing?
So, yeah, generally what happens, is sentencing occurs down the road. It's not an
Mm.
immediate thing. And the delay is caused from they have probation officers do a pre-sentence investigation wherein they gather up kind of a mini biography of the person. So the judge has an idea of where they've come from, if they've got a criminal record, what good things they've done in the community as well.
Okay.
And then it's another hearing, so witnesses are offered, and the judge listens to all that, and a lot of times the victims will hear the mother could have made a statement, um, the 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 father could have addressed the court if he wanted to. But yes, I mean, certainly his military history would be taken into account, but it'd be weighed against all the factors. And getting a sentence of 18 months to me rings that the prosecution probably didn't do a real good job. Earlier you mentioned that the doctor that testified was not a doctor
Mm-hmm.
that was involved in the direct care
Right.
of EJ. And that's, as a defense attorney, that's something I would jump all over. You've got the death of a child and you can't even bring in the doctor that saw the child. You're just going to find the one with the easiest schedule. How many other shortcuts have you taken in this investigation when you won't even take the time to bring in somebody who witnessed EJ's injuries?
Mm-hmm.
And so I suspect that the prosecution probably didn't do a real good job in presenting evidence of culpability and intent and things like that during the hearing. And the defense, may have had an easier battlefield to fight on than you would think.
Yeah, and bringing up that doctor, I can see maybe bringing her in as an impartial observer afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
but have one of the doctors, like the one who did tell Nikki Dudley, you know, this is not an accident. It doesn't look like an accident to us. Who had to break the news to her that he was brain dead. They were
Mm-hmm.
actively involved at that time. And just like with the pathologist afterwards and the abuse experts, they're kind of taking a step back and looking at it. So if the
Right.
doctor had been presented in that manner, okay, but then have a doctor who actually looked at EJ in person and could
Right.
see those things that you just can't describe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, this was, like I said, on the news, it was a pretty big case as far as, watching it on, the TV, those types of things, but not as much in terms of articles. That actually did surprise me a lot when trying to research it. I'm trying to think of things that I remember seeing on TV. Um, I think it was hard too to accept that a service member when, you know, we in Delaware, we were proud of we see the role that it's served through the previous wars, that it's serving currently. And I think as a state, it was hard to handle that a service member, even though they weren't from the state,
Mm-hmm.
they represented that Air Force base and they took the most innocent of lives that are out there, a small child,
Right.
and the small child of someone who was serving overseas.
Right.
And I think that's kind of why it was on the news every night. It was just really hard to see someone that we respect military than having them put in this case. But like I said, bad apples. But then again, I say that, then I step back and say, is he a completely bad apple, or is it just that 1 5 minute time period, or however long it took
Sure.
out of his whole life? But that's the thing, all it takes is a minute.
Yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
we've all been in situations where we've done something stupid and immediately regretted
Mm-hmm.
it.
Oh,
Fortunately,
yeah.
we haven't all been in the situation where we've killed a child.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, just from what you've described and laid out, the injuries are really concerning,
Mm-hmm.
because that's, to me, as a layperson, I don't believe you get that level of injuries from falling downstairs. And that makes me think there had to be more going
Mm-hmm.
on than what we're being told.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, if for at least Alabama, I'm considered pretty liberal and a bleeding heart and all that because I worked in criminal defense. And I'm not one who's, takes a hard stance on a lot of things. But being presented with something like that, I'd have a hard time just giving probation. That,
Yeah.
that's just too worrisome to me. To have a detached retina, and didn't you say there were evidence of internal injuries as well beyond the brain?
Yeah. There were injuries. There was like bleeding between the brain and the skull,
Mm-hmm.
and the articles always mentioned carpeted
Yeah,
stairs.
yeah,
And the first time I saw that, I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure they're saying carpeted for a
Right.
reason. And yeah, it's not like he fell down 8 concrete steps that didn't have any cushioning.
Yeah.
It had something there. And it was important. That was a very important distinction to make as compared to blocks and concrete or things like that. Um, and I tend to be very middle of the road. I'm very analytical, and I do try to look at every single side. That I've never been in somebody's particular shoes, try to look at it from their perspective. And I think that's why I can question exactly, okay, when did he get these injuries?
Sure.
Was it beyond a reasonable doubt? Um, but once the jury had all the evidence that they had, and admittedly, there's probably a lot of things that were covered in the actual court case that they didn't put in the articles and that I
Sure.
couldn't find online. So, presented with that information, they made that verdict, and it almost seems like the sentencing guideline of up to 8 years was kind of like, oh, well, it's there, but, just kind of being soft with it. I mean, poor Nikki Dudley is going to wake up every morning, and probably the first thing she's going to think of is her son, whether it's, almost a reaction to think he's still there, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
I'm going to go get him up from bed. Oh, but, she did that for 16 months, and all of a sudden, he's not there, and she expects him to be. And to think about all he missed because a person, for such a short time in his life, may have been a good and caring person 99.99% of the time, was that one little millisecond or minutes, and it destroyed lives, not just his own life, but Evan's, Nikki's, and his family too. His kids are going to grow up without a
Yep.
father. So it's more than
Oh yeah.
just
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
more
The
than,
impact goes way beyond just
mhm,
him, and that's something the court would consider in their sentencing.
yeah,
Um, along with, I assume since he's found guilty of a felony, he probably doesn't have a career in the Air Force anymore.
yeah,
So he'd be starting over from scratch. There's a lot to weigh, but just Brad speaking for Brad and playing Monday morning quarterback and not knowing exactly what happened in the trial, what evidence was presented, and all that. I just have a hard time with the idea of a death of a child resulting in probation.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it wasn't talking like he turned around on the stairs not knowing Evan was behind him and he
Mm-hmm.
fell. That's an accident. That is pure 100% accident. The injuries did not reflect that.
Yeah,
So,
well, and I mean, even if he gets mad and he pushes the kid, or
mhm,
whatever, the lack of con- objective concern afterwards
mhm,
is really concerning. Um, to not take any steps to really take care of the child
mhm.
or to aid him, it looks bad.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that his son Jax does not remember any of this. I think
Right.
he was
Yeah.
around 2ish, so hopefully it's early enough that he's not going to remember seeing a child fall like that, or seeing what his father did, or what the exact circumstances were. That he does not remember that growing up, and that if he does somehow remember any of that, that he's given the help that he needs. Um, I think that's something we have to look at. And previously I said, but maybe say, okay, you know what, I'm going to email Brad. Is you had an episode where you mentioned mental health, and I could tell that you were pretty passionate about that.
Hmm.
And the third episode that I did for this show, I went into it thinking this guy is, he killed 2 people. He left 8 children without a father, a total of 8 children without a father, shot at least 3 other people that day, almost shot a lot more, like a sleeping child in their house. Um,
Hmm.
and just as a background, if this is your first episode listening, in episode 3, someone did go throughout 2 states actually, um, Delaware and Maryland, and was randomly shooting in some places, and then in other places aimed. He actually intended to kill people. But there were so many things that happened to him as a child that were never addressed. His brother actually went through the same type of trauma, and his brother was also. And in this particular case, he was, laying on the ground crying for help. Literally, he was crying for help. Mm-hmm. And nobody got him that help. And, thinking
Yep.
back to, say, Jax, or as they said with Corbett, he received counseling. Anytime there's a trauma like that, there has to be an openness or an understanding that counseling may be needed, to not be ashamed to say that you need counseling, and for people to recognize that, and not just the parents, but the schools, counselors, things like that, to try to make sure anybody who goes through any type of trauma like this has the help that they need. And I know that was a little bit off topic, but I am thinking of everybody else who was impacted by this crime, and that his youngest son may still have some memories about it, and making sure that he's taken care of.
Right. Yeah, because it definitely could have a very negative impact on his life and drive him in a totally different direction than where he should have gone.
Yeah, you can go from being either a productive member of society to someone who causes chaos, basically. And I don't, I from that case, that third episode, somehow my whole position on some things, I don't want to say they changed, but it allowed me to look at things more objectively. I guess you would say that, stepping back from it, I can't judge the whole situation based on a couple pieces of information. I need to, kind of look at everything. And I guess maybe that's what the judge was doing, looking at everything and thinking he's done a lot of good in his life, but he hurt a lot of people too. Corbett did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's see, we've been going about an hour and a half, but I think it was a really good episode, and I really thank you for those perspectives too. You're kind of seeing it from, a legal perspective, and also, people need different perspectives because everybody's situations aren't the same. And so, it's good to get other ideas about a certain case.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I mean, that's part of why I got into podcasting is getting frustrated listening to podcasts where they start talking about the law and have no idea what they're talking about. So I'm glad I was able to come on and maybe offer some useful perspective today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even after reading through a lot of research, there are still things that I know I probably missed, or things that I just had never heard of before or didn't think about because I'd never come across it. So I'll also leave a link to your podcast in my description if anyone wants to go over and listen. Like I said, I've binged them a few times. Like take a few episodes and I'll listen. And like I said, you did sound sincere, and that's what really grabbed me. And
well, thank you. And I am, just because it's frustrating to see people who are not bad sorts, who are just suffering from a medical condition, and they're not getting any help. And because of that, they, as I said multiple times during my career, the color in their sky is not the same as ours. And so they make odd decisions that end up getting them arrested. And really, particularly in Alabama, we don't fund any mental health resources in any meaningful way.
oh man,
And we leave the burden on the criminal justice system to take these people that are problematic and lock them in a cage, which, expends taxpayer resources and takes up space that we could put, child traffickers or drug traffickers, people of that ilk that we would want to have locked up, instead of this guy that's just sick.
yeah. And not only the resources of the money that it takes to house the person in jail, but also what that person could have given back to society.
Exactly.
Like they may have become a counselor
Yep.
themselves, or whatever they wanted to do, but now they're not giving back to society either. So it's like this double whammy. It's not just losing resources by taxpayer funding, it's also what this person could have done and now they're not doing.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
And so, that's what, as the podcast has evolved, I started out with more like, okay, well, this interests me to, by episode 3, I'm like, okay, there's a lot here that, I think unless you start to research, you don't realize just how much, really goes on behind the scenes. We just hear this person did this crime, but then there's so much in between. And hopefully that will help the rest of us spot things, be able to help others. I know we don't live in a perfect world. Trust me, yeah, we do not live in a perfect world or a perfect society. But I think the more people who are willing to step in, maybe recognize or educate themselves about certain things, the better society will be overall, the healthier society will be.
Yeah,
So,
and I mean, you bring up a good point because we have to remember the media is only going to present the juicy bits.
mm-hmm,
Nobody wants to listen to a doctor testify for 4 hours and summarize that. We want to
exactly.
hear about how was he killed, what weapon did he use, or how did he cover it up, and so that
Mm-hmm,
skews our view a lot of times
mm-hmm,
into as to how the criminal justice system actually works, and it causes judges to get lots of hate mail and um, things like that. When in reality, there's so much more that goes on, and until you really sit down and try to go through a case,
mm-hmm,
you see that how it's presented in the media versus how it's presented at trial are two different things.
mm-hmm,
And you'll have a lot of media reports about things that occurred that never get shown to the jury for one reason or another.
mm-hmm.
And so it's I always caution people not to rush to judgment in a case, even when what you're seeing seems like it's open and shut. you know the ugly way I put it is a trial is not about getting to the truth. The trial is about presenting the best evidence you can, and we hope that through the adversarial process we get to the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, it's a little bit of a game, and it comes down to the quality of the people involved and what they can do to find ways to present information or to keep certain information out. And it's just a lot more complex than people seem to think.
I think it's years of growing up on with Matlock, where
Yeah.
2 weeks later, like I said, they're in court, and it's like, no, 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 no.
No,
Oh,
no, no. I would tell my client's family that you're looking at 2 years before you'll see the inside of a courtroom. Uh-oh.
so Brad and I did go off on a couple different topics, but at the same time, it was really good to get a perspective of an attorney, someone with legal background, you know, to get a different view of things, looking at it differently than just someone who's following a case on TV. So I really appreciate that he did join me for this episode. It was a very difficult episode because my heart is saying that, of course, his punishment should have been so much more severe. It should not have been, you know, suspended or anything like that. A child is dead, and there's really not any answers when it comes down to it. From a legal standpoint, I do understand that there could be some reasonable doubt to some things in regards to the case. We weren't there on the jury. We just have the newspaper articles that we may, find about the case. was there something that the judge saw or knew that would have, kind of pushed the judge to, go with a lighter sentence or no? How much of a factor did his military service play in it, if any? But as a mother, just ever since I did become a mother, I've been very, very empathetic. I mean, some of my emotions have changed so much that, whenever there's a situation about any case, I just automatically think of the parents. And, it's unimaginable what some parents go through in terms of, when there's a crime against their child. It's the fight for justice and making sure that the person who did it both gets the punishment that they deserve, as well as making sure that they're not out on the streets to do something to someone else. That has to be tempered, though, with facts and some of the actual presentation in this case, as far as the doctor who actually did not treat him giving testimony, and the way it was presented, they may have been able to get someone who actually treated him as well, and then had the other doctor come on and say that she was looking at it from a third party perspective, just looking at facts, because she wasn't there when he was being treated. And I can only imagine that the doctors and nurses, any medical staff that was in there when he was brought in, even though people try to stay detached as much as they can when they're treating someone, afterwards, they have to probably take a step back and say, oh my God, that was a baby. That was an intentional infliction of wounds. So, it's very hard not to get emotional, I would think. And so it would have been good to have both perspectives from someone who, felt the emotion, felt the, kind of the energy in the room. And by energy, I'm not only talking about, how quickly they were moving. I'm talking about the actual feelings in the room, but then having that, kind of impartial third person in there to say, well, this is looking at just the facts. I think that was one of the bigger, I don't want to say problems, but maybe, misjudging of the situation and not getting a treating doctor on the stand. So I appreciate everybody hanging in for, a very long episode, but this story is, very important in a couple of ways. And, Corbett previously, pretty much from what the article said, had a spotless record. He was decorated for his service. So, did that play a part? But looking at him initially, you wouldn't think that anything bad would happen. But it just took possibly just a moment for him to get angry or to snap. And the young life of a small child was taken. The dreams that his mother had for him were gone in just really a couple of moments. Yes, EJ hung on for a little while, but it was those moments with Corbett that changed a lot of people's lives. So, I will talk to everybody soon. I actually want to try to get another episode out by the end of the week. I have, quite a few episodes that I'm working on, whether I'm, reached out for more information and I'm waiting on those, or I'm just still, gathering information. But, unfortunately, there are a lot of tragedies that did take place on Delmarva. So I will talk to everybody then. And until then, have a safe and happy week. Bye-bye.